I'm Edward, your host, and it's always a pleasure to gather here with you. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what Christmas was like in your home when you were a child. Leave a note below and subscribe if you'd like to make these mysteries part of your evenings. Now make yourself comfortable and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. A Spare Room Kept Ready. There was a particular quality to the light in St. Mary Mead during the Christmas season. Miss Marple reflected, standing at her sitting-room window and observing the frost-touched hedgerows gleaming in the late morning sun. It was the sort of light that made everything appear both familiar and slightly transformed, as though the ordinary world had been dipped in silver and set carefully back in its accustomed place. The village took Christmas seriously, not in the frantic, overwrought manner that sometimes afflicted larger towns, but with a quiet determination that spare rooms should be aired, guest cups brought down from high shelves, and invitations extended with genuine warmth. It was a matter of pride, really, that St. Mary Mead understood the proper observance of hospitality. Miss Marple had heard a great deal about hospitality that morning. Mrs. Bantry had called round for tea the previous afternoon and spoken at length about the various arrangements being made throughout the village. The Prices were expecting their son from London. Miss Weatherby had invited her nephew and his young family. Even Colonel Melchett, not generally given to domestic enthusiasm, had mentioned that his sister would be arriving on the 23rd, but it was Mrs. Constance Lyle who appeared most frequently in these conversations, always with a particular note of admiration. "Such a generous woman," Mrs. Bantry had said, settling more comfortably into her chair. "Taking in Mr. Fairfax all those years ago, and never a word of complaint." Miss Marple had murmured something appropriately approving, though her fingers had paused momentarily in their knitting. She was familiar with Mr. Julian Fairfax, of course, in the way one is familiar with all residents of a small village, but she realised she knew remarkably little about the man himself. "How long has Mr. Fairfax been staying at Rosehaven?" she had asked, her tone mild and interested. Mrs. Bantry had looked thoughtful. "Oh, it must be 20 years now. Or is it longer? He arrived one Christmas, just for the holidays, you know, and somehow he never quite left. Mrs. Lyle was widowed by then, of course, and I suppose she welcomed the company." "How very kind of her," Miss Marple had observed. "Oh, indeed, not many would be so patient. But then Mrs. Lyle has always been that sort of person, very charitable, very Christian in her outlook." Miss Marple had said nothing more on the subject, but her knitting needles had resumed their steady rhythm, and her mind had begun to turn over this information in the quiet, methodical way that was characteristic of her thinking. Now, standing at her window on this bright December morning, she found herself observing the daily life of the village with particular attention. She had always believed that one learned more from watching how people moved through their ordinary days than from any amount of deliberate questioning. Rosehaven was visible from her sitting-room, a comfortable house of modest proportions with a well-tended garden and cream-coloured walls that caught the morning light. It sat on the edge of the village proper, close enough to be part of the community but separated by a short drive lined with bare rose bushes that would bloom magnificently come summer. As Miss Marple watched, the front door opened and Mrs. Constance Lyle emerged, wrapped in a sensible wool coat and carrying a shopping basket. She was a woman in her early 70s, trim and upright, with silver hair arranged in careful waves in a manner that suggested both capability and dignity. She had been widowed for nearly 30 years, Miss Marple recalled, her husband having been a solicitor in the nearby town of Much Benham. Mrs. Lyle paused on her doorstep to pull on her gloves with precise movements, then set off down the path with the steady gait of one accustomed to managing her own affairs efficiently. There was no sign of Mr. Fairfax. Miss Marple considered this. She had seen Mr. Fairfax about the village from time to time, a thin, somewhat stooped man of perhaps 60 years, with sparse grey hair and an apologetic manner of walking, as though he perpetually feared he might be in someone's way. He was always neatly dressed in clothing that had the particular quality of being well maintained, but slightly out of date, and he greeted those he passed with courteous nods that were returned with varying degrees of warmth. But now that she thought about it, Miss Marple realised she had never seen him in the company of anyone other than Mrs. Lyle. He attended church, certainly, sitting in the Lisle pew, 3 rows from the front. He occasionally visited the greengrocer or the post office, but always alone and always with the air of someone completing an errand rather than engaging in the social exchanges that formed the texture of village life. It was curious, really. Miss Marple's musings were interrupted by a knock at her door. Her maid, who came in daily, admitted Miss Hartnell, the village's most energetic disseminator of information, still slightly breathless from her walk. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, settling herself without preamble into the most comfortable chair, "I've just been speaking with Mrs. Price, and she tells me that the carol singing this year will include a stop at Rosehaven. Mrs. Lisle has been so generous to the church, and of course Mr. Fairfax is always so appreciative of music." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said, resuming her seat by the window. "Mr. Fairfax is musical, then?" "Oh, I believe he plays the piano, or did at any rate. I seem to remember hearing something about it years ago." Miss Hartnell paused, frowning slightly. "Though I don't believe I've ever actually heard him play, but then one hears so many things." "One does indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "He seems a very quiet gentleman." Very quiet. Very grateful, too, for Mrs. Lisle's kindness in taking him in. Such a fortunate arrangement for him, really. After that dreadful business with the failed investment and his broken engagement, he might have ended up in quite reduced circumstances. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "That was many years ago, I collect." "Oh yes, before the war. Or was it just after? Time does run together so, but the point is, he came for Christmas, meant to stay just a few weeks until he got his feet under him again, and Mrs. Lisle simply couldn't bear to turn him out. Not when he had nowhere else to go and no prospects to speak of. Very Christian of her." "Very Christian indeed," Miss Marple murmured. After Miss Hartnell had departed, having exhausted the topic of Christmas arrangements and moved on to equally pressing matters concerning the vicar's wife's choice of decorations for the church hall, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting. 20 years, she thought, or perhaps longer. A guest who had come for Christmas and never left. She found herself thinking of her own spare room, always kept ready for visiting nephews or the occasional friend from her youth who might pass through the village. It was a cheerful room, she liked to think, with fresh curtains and a vase of flowers when occupied, but it was meant for visitors, not permanent residents. There was something in the very nature of a spare room that implied temporariness, a way station rather than a destination. What would it be like, she wondered, to live perpetually in someone else's spare room? To be always the guest, never the host? To have no space that was truly one's own, but only space that was graciously lent? And what would it be like to be the gracious lender, year after year, Christmas after Christmas, with the spare room never quite becoming spare again? Miss Marple looked out at Rosehaven, peaceful in the December sunlight. Somewhere inside that comfortable house, Mr. Julian Fairfax was presumably going about his day, whatever that entailed for a man who had nowhere else to be. The village spoke of him, when it spoke of him at all, as though he were a piece of furniture. Present, useful in some vague way, unquestioned. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily on, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over questions that had not yet fully formed themselves, examining the peculiar mathematics of hospitality that could add up to 20 years in a spare room. Outside, the winter light began to fade, and the village prepared itself for another evening. Christmas was coming as it always did, bringing with it the rituals of welcome and warmth. But Miss Marple found herself wondering, not for the first time in her long experience of human nature, whether warmth and welcome were always quite the same thing. Chapter 2. The Death After Twelfth Night. The news reached Miss Marple on a cold Thursday morning, delivered by her maid with the sort of hushed solemnity that attends unexpected deaths in small communities. "Mr. Fairfax has passed away, ma'am." Mrs. Price's girl heard it from the butcher's boy, who had it from Dr. Haydock's housekeeper. Went in his sleep, they say, sometime during the night. Miss Marple set down her teacup with care. How very odd. Poor Mr. Fairfax. And poor Mrs. Lisle, of course. "Indeed, ma'am, after all these years of looking after him." The date, Miss Marple noted, was the 7th of January. Twelfth Night had been 2 days previous, marking the formal end of the Christmas season. The decorations would be coming down throughout the village, the greenery that had adorned mantels and doorways consigned now to garden bonfires. There was always something melancholy about that particular transition, the return to ordinary time after the festive interlude. That Mr. Fairfax should die precisely then struck Miss Marple as oddly fitting, though she could not have said exactly why. Dr. Haydock called round that afternoon, ostensibly to check on a slight cold Miss Marple had mentioned the previous week, but really she suspected because he wished to talk. Dr. Haydock was a good doctor and a sensible man, but he had practised in St. Mary Mead long enough to know that the elderly spinster knitting by the fire often understood his patients better than he did himself. Heart failure, he said, accepting the tea she offered. Quite peaceful by all appearances. Mrs. Lyle found him this morning when he didn't come down to breakfast. He'd simply failed to wake up. At his age, such things are not uncommon, Miss Marple observed. No, indeed. He was 63 and his health had never been robust. Dr. Haydock stirred his tea thoughtfully. Still, it's rather a shock. One becomes accustomed to people being there, you know. Fairfax was part of the sheet. Furniture at Rosehaven. There was that phrase again. Miss Marple's needles maintained their rhythm. Had you been treating him for any particular complaint? Nothing serious. A touch of rheumatism, some digestive troubles, the usual ailments of a sedentary life. Dr. Haydock paused. He was always very apologetic about bothering me, thanked me excessively for the smallest service. Some people are like that, Miss Marple said gently. Yes. Dr. Haydock fell silent, gazing into his teacup as though it might contain answers to questions he had not quite formulated. Mrs. Lyle was remarkably composed when I arrived, distressed naturally, but very much in command of herself. She'd already begun making the necessary arrangements. She is a very capable woman. She is indeed. He set down his cup. I suppose it will be strange for her after all these years. The house will seem quite empty. After Dr. Haydock had departed, Miss Marple sat for some time without resuming her knitting. She found herself thinking about the various forms that grief could take, and how sometimes the most profound reactions were the quietest ones. The village response to Mr. Fairfax's death revealed itself gradually over the following days, like a photograph developing in chemical solution, the true picture emerging slowly from what had at first appeared uniform. Some people were genuinely affected. Miss Weatherby, who had a tender heart despite her brisk manner, spoke of it with moist eyes. Poor man! To die in someone else's house, never having had a proper home of his own again. It seems rather tragic. The vicar, calling at Rosehaven to offer his condolences, reported that Mrs. Lyle had received him with dignity and gratitude. She spoke very kindly of Mr. Fairfax, said he had been no trouble at all, really, a quiet presence in the household. But there were others whose reaction suggested something more complex than simple sorrow. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Price in the greengrocer's, discussing the death with Mrs. Hartley in tones that carried a distinct note of relief. Well, it's a blessing in a way, isn't it? For Mrs. Lyle, I mean. She's been so patient all these years, but it must have been wearing having a permanent guest. Now she'll be able to have her house to herself again. I've always thought it rather odd, Mrs. Hartley confided, lowering her voice. The way he simply stayed and stayed. As though he'd forgotten he was supposed to be temporary. Perhaps he had nowhere else to go. Even so, 20 years is a very long time to impose on someone's hospitality. Miss Marple, selecting apples with apparent absorption, noted that neither woman had ever seemed particularly concerned about the oddness of the arrangement while Mr. Fairfax was alive. Colonel Melchett, encountering Miss Marple on the high street, spoke with the bluff heartiness of a man uncomfortable with mortality. Sad business about Fairfax. Still, he had a good innings, and Mrs. Lyle looked after him splendidly. Can't ask for more than that, really. Indeed not, Miss Marple agreed. Natural causes, Haydock says. Nothing suspicious about it. Miss Marple had not suggested there was, but she found it interesting that the Colonel felt moved to mention it. At the lending library, Where Miss Marple went to return a novel that had failed to hold her attention, she encountered Miss Hartnell in a state of animated conversation with the librarian. "I always said Mrs. Lyle was a saint, a positive saint. Not many women would have borne it so gracefully. And now, of course, she'll have some peace in her old age, though I'm sure she'll miss him dreadfully." The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Simmons, made a non-committal sound. "You don't think she'll miss him?" Miss Hartnell asked, with the slightly affronted air of one whose pronouncements have been questioned. "I'm sure I couldn't say," Mrs. Simmons replied carefully, "but I've noticed that people sometimes miss the idea of a person more than the person themselves." It was, Miss Marple reflected, as she walked home through the January cold, a perceptive observation. That evening, sitting alone with her knitting and a modest fire, Miss Marple found herself considering the various emotions that Mr. Fairfax's death had released into the village atmosphere. Grief, certainly, but also relief, and something else harder to name. A sense, perhaps, that a situation which had gone on too long had finally reached its natural conclusion. But had it been natural? That was the question that occupied her thoughts as the winter darkness gathered outside her windows. There was nothing suspicious about the death itself. Dr. Haydock was thorough and honest. If he said it was heart failure, then heart failure it was. But deaths, even innocent ones, could illuminate truths that had been obscured by the simple fact of someone's continued existence. People, Miss Marple had observed, often revealed more in their responses to an ending than they ever did during the ongoing situation itself. It was as though death granted permission to speak truths that had been suppressed by politeness or habit. And what she was hearing, in the various reactions scattered throughout St. Mary Mead, was a curious mixture of pity and relief, admiration and unease, all centred around the fundamental strangeness of a man who had been a guest for 20 years. She thought about Dr. Haydock's phrase, "part of the furniture." Furniture did not choose where it was placed. It served the needs of those who arranged it, and stayed where it was put until someone decided to move it elsewhere. Had Mr. Fairfax chosen to stay at Rosehaven, or had he somehow been unable to leave? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the quiet room. Outside, the village prepared for sleep, the death of Julian Fairfax already becoming part of its collective memory. Another small notation in the long history of St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that the most important questions were often the ones nobody thought to ask, found herself wondering not about how Mr. Fairfax had died, but about how he had lived, and more particularly about why. Chapter 3, Pity Offered Without End. The funeral was held on a grey Saturday morning with a respectable turnout, considering that Mr. Fairfax had been, in many ways, an invisible presence in the village. Miss Marple attended, as she attended most funerals in St. Mary Mead, finding them useful occasions for observing the social fabric of the community at a moment when its usual patterns were both heightened and disrupted. Mrs. Lyle sat in the front pew, composed in black, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap. She had the bearing of a woman accustomed to meeting obligations with dignity, and there was genuine sorrow in her expression, Miss Marple thought, though perhaps not the sorrow of losing someone irreplaceable so much as the sorrow of witnessing an ending that raised uncomfortable questions about the years that had preceded it. The vicar spoke kindly of Mr. Fairfax, though his eulogy had the slightly general quality of words composed for someone one had known for many years without ever really knowing at all. He mentioned Mr. Fairfax's quiet demeanour, his regular attendance at services, his gratitude for Mrs. Lyle's Christian charity. Gratitude. The word appeared several times in the vicar's brief remarks, and Miss Marple found herself counting the repetitions with the same attention she might give to a recurring phrase in a piece of music. After the service, the gathering at Rosehaven was well attended. Mrs. Lyle had prepared for it with her characteristic efficiency, and the rooms were arranged to accommodate the stream of visitors who came to pay their respects, and, Miss Marple suspected, to satisfy a certain curiosity about the house that had been Mr. Fairfax's home for 2 decades. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and positioned herself near the fireplace, where she could observe without appearing to do so. It was a skill she'd cultivated over many years, this ability to seem merely a pleasant elderly lady while in fact missing very little of what occurred around her. The conversations that drifted through the drawing room had a peculiar sameness to them. Again and again, people spoke of how fortunate Mr. Fairfax had been, how lucky to have found such a haven after his misfortunes, how grateful he must have been for Mrs. Lyle's endless generosity. She saved him, really, Mrs. Bantry was saying to a small group near the window. After that business failure and the broken engagement, he had nothing. No prospects, no family to speak of. Mrs. Lyle took him in when he had nowhere else to turn. A true act of Christian charity, Miss Weatherby agreed. Not many would have been so patient. 20 years, someone murmured. That's quite remarkable. Mrs. Lyle never complained, Mrs. Bantry continued, never made him feel unwelcome. She simply looked after him, year after year. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The narrative being constructed around her was a comfortable one, a story the village could tell itself with satisfaction. It cast Mrs. Lyle as the generous benefactor, and Mr. Fairfax as the rescued unfortunate, grateful to the end for the sanctuary he had been provided. It was, she reflected, the sort of story that people liked. It had clear moral lines, clear roles, and it required nothing complicated of those who heard it. But what struck Miss Marple, listening with her particular attention to what was said and equally to what was not said, was how little anyone mentioned about what Mr. Fairfax himself had wanted. He had been fortunate, he had been looked after, he had been grateful, but had he been happy? Had he wished to stay or merely accepted that he had no choice? Had he wanted to build a life of his own? Or had he resigned himself to living in the margins of someone else's? These questions did not appear in the conversations flowing around her. Colonel Melchett, helping himself to a second slice of cake, held forth to a captive audience about the importance of charity. "This is what England used to mean," he declared, in the portentous tones he reserved for pronouncements of moral significance. "Looking after those less fortunate, not leaving a man to sink when he's had a bit of bad luck. Mrs. Lyle understood that, and she acted accordingly. Fairfax knew he was well off here. He certainly seemed content," someone ventured. "Content?" Colonel Melchett considered this. "I should think he was grateful, more like. Knew his good fortune. A man in his position couldn't expect more than a roof over his head and regular meals." Miss Marple found this assessment interesting. It suggested that Mr. Fairfax's expectations should have been limited by his circumstances, that he ought to have been satisfied with shelter and sustenance, regardless of what else he might have wished for in life. She moved quietly to another group, where Mrs. Price was describing her few interactions with the deceased. Always so polite when one encountered him in the village, always ready, with a pleasant word, though he never stopped to chat really. Just a greeting and then he'd be on his way. "Where did he go?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Price blinked. "I'm sorry. When you saw him in the village, where was he going?" "Oh, well, I suppose to the post office, perhaps, or the Green Growers. He ran errands for Mrs. Lyle sometimes." "Did he have errands of his own?" Mrs. Price looked momentarily confused by the question. "I'm sure I couldn't say. I suppose he must have done," but her expression suggested she had never considered the matter, had never thought about Mr. Fairfax as someone who might have personal business, separate from his role in Mrs. Lyle's household. Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Lyle herself near the tea table, supervising the replenishment of cups with the careful attention to detail that seemed characteristic of her. "My dear Mrs. Lyle," Miss Marple said warmly, "you have borne up wonderfully through this difficult time." "Thank you, Miss Marple. One does what one must." Mrs. Lyle's voice was steady, but there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Mr. Fairfax would have wished everything to be done properly. I'm sure he appreciated all you did for him over the years." "I hope so." Mrs. Lyle adjusted the position of the milk jug with precision. "I did try to make him comfortable, to give him a sense of security after all his troubles." "It must have been a great responsibility," Miss Marple suggested softly. A responsibility, yes. Mrs. Lyle paused, and for a moment something flickered in her expression. Something that might have been doubt or perhaps weariness, but also a privilege, to be able to help someone in need. The prepared phrase came easily to her lips, and Miss Marple recognised it as something that had been said many times before, a comfortable formulation that had hardened through repetition into something like truth. After the gathering had dispersed and Miss Marple was walking home through the January chill, she found herself thinking about the stories people told to make sense of complicated situations. The village had settled on a story about Mr. Fairfax that was generous and kind, that reflected well on Mrs. Lyle and on the community's values. But stories, Miss Marple knew, were often constructed to comfort the teller, rather than to illuminate the truth. And the most telling detail in any story was often what it chose to leave out. In all the talk of rescue and shelter and gratitude, no one had mentioned what Mr. Fairfax had given up by staying. No one had spoken of the life he might have had elsewhere, the choices he might have made if circumstances had been different. Pity, Miss Marple reflected as she reached her gate, was often generous. It could be warm and sincere, offered from the heart. But pity, once given, could also become fixed, like concrete setting around someone's feet. It could define a person so completely that they became unable to step outside its confines, unable to be anything other than the object of someone else's compassion. And the truly troubling thing about pity, she thought settling back into her chair by the fire, was that it asked nothing of the recipient except gratitude. Never what they wanted, never what they dreamed of, only that they remained forever grateful for what they had been given, and never suggest they might have wished for something more. Chapter 4, Conversations That Circled Back. The days following the funeral brought a curious phenomenon that Miss Marple had observed before in the wake of a death. People began to remember things, small fragments of the past surfacing like objects revealed by a receding tide. It was as though Mr. Fairfax's absence had created a space in which memories could finally be examined. Miss Marple found herself the recipient of several of these recollections, delivered in the casual way that characterized village conversation. She suspected this was because she had the reputation of being a good listener, which was quite true, though her listening was rather more purposeful than most people realized. It was Mrs. Simmons from the lending library who first mentioned the business failure. "I remember when Mr. Fairfax arrived," she said, stamping Miss Marple's borrowed books with methodical precision. "It was the Christmas of 1932, or perhaps 30. There had been some sort of investment scheme that collapsed. Property development, I believe, though I may be misremembering. Several people were affected, but Mr. Fairfax most severely." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. "Indeed. And then there was the matter of his engagement." Mrs. Simmons lowered her voice, though the library was empty save for themselves. "Miss Cordelia Ashton, a young woman from a very good family in Much Benham. When the money went, so did the engagement. Quite devastating for him, I understand." "Young women sometimes have practical considerations," Miss Marple observed neutrally. "Oh, quite, though I always thought it rather cold. Still, Mr. Fairfax bore it with dignity. Mrs. Lyle was a friend of his mother's, you know. She invited him for Christmas when he had nowhere else to go. Very kind of her." "And he intended to leave in the spring?" "So I understood. He was going to look for a position, get back on his feet. But then—" Mrs. Simmons paused, frowning slightly. "I'm not entirely sure what happened. The spring came, and he was still at Rosehaven. And then another year passed, and another. Did he look for a position? I believe he may have made some inquiries. But by then, you see, the depression had worsened, and men with better credentials were struggling to find work. And he had been out of employment for a year or more. These things become more difficult the longer they continue." Miss Marple walked home through the cold afternoon considering this information. A man arrives for Christmas, meaning to stay a few weeks. Spring comes, but finding a position proves harder than expected. Another year passes, and then somehow 20 years have gone by, and the temporary guest has become permanent. But at what point had Mr. Fairfax stopped trying to leave? The question occupied her thoughts over the next several days, during which other fragments of memory emerged from various sources. Dr. Haydock, calling round to check on her imaginary cold, mentioned that Mr. Fairfax had spoken of finding lodgings in Much Benham. This was years ago, mind you. 10 years, perhaps. He asked me about the town, whether I knew of any respectable boarding houses. Said he thought it might be time to have his own establishment, however modest. But he never went. Apparently not. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Lyle some weeks later, she looked rather distressed. Said she'd persuaded him it would be foolish to waste money on lodgings when he had a perfectly good room at Rosehaven, much more economical to stay put. I see. She was quite right, of course, Dr. Haydock added. From a practical standpoint, Fairfax had very little income, just a small annuity from his mother's estate. He could ill afford to pay for separate accommodation. Miss Marple said nothing, but she thought about the mathematics of such an arrangement. How much did independence cost? And at what point did the price become too high to pay? Miss Weatherby provided another piece of the puzzle during an encounter at the draper's shop. I remember Mr. Fairfax mentioning a cousin in Somerset, she said, examining a bolt of wool crepe. This must have been 8 or 9 years ago. The cousin had written to suggest Mr. Fairfax might come for an extended visit, perhaps stay through the summer. A farmhouse, I believe, with plenty of room. Did he go? No. Mrs. Lyle had planned a small house party that July, and she particularly needed Mr. Fairfax's assistance with the arrangements. He was very good at that sort of thing, you know, details and organisation. She relied on him considerably. The draper's assistant, a young woman who had been quietly arranging ribbons, spoke up unexpectedly. My grandmother was in service at Rosehaven for a time, she offered diffidently. She said Mr. Fairfax once received an invitation to join a walking tour in the Lake District, a group of old-school friends, but Mrs. Lyle had taken ill with influenza just before he was meant to leave, and of course he couldn't abandon her when she was unwell. Of course not, Miss Weatherby agreed. That would have been most inconsiderate. Gran said he never mentioned the Lake District again after that. Miss Marple purchased her thread and walked home slowly, piecing together a pattern from these scattered recollections. Spring plans deferred because finding employment was difficult. A move to Much Benham dismissed as wasteful. A visit to Somerset postponed for a house party. A walking tour cancelled for an illness. Each instance perfectly reasonable in isolation. Each excuse quite legitimate. But together they formed something more troubling. A series of small abandonments that added up to a life perpetually deferred. That evening Miss Marple had a visitor. Mrs. Bantry arrived just after tea time, ostensibly to return a book, but really, Miss Marple suspected, because she wished to talk. I've been thinking about poor Mr. Fairfax, she said, settling into her usual chair, trying to remember when I last heard him speak of his plans. You know the sort of thing one says, next year I shall do this, or when things improve I intend to do that. And what did you all recall? That's just it. I can't remember him ever speaking that way, not in recent years at any rate. It's as though he had stopped making plans entirely. Perhaps he was content as he was, Miss Marple suggested, though her tone invited disagreement. Perhaps, but it seems rather sad, doesn't it? To have no plans, no future one is working toward, just an endless present, living in someone else's house, following someone else's rhythms. Mrs. Bantry paused. I wonder if he minded. Did you ever ask him? Good heavens, no. It would have been terribly impertinent. And besides, one doesn't ask such questions. He seems settled enough. After Mrs. Bantry had departed, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, watching the firelight play across the walls of her sitting room. She thought about all the small moments when Mr. Fairfax might have left Rosehaven, all the opportunities that had somehow failed to materialize, plans that had circled back on themselves, always returning to the same conclusion, that it was more sensible, more practical, more considerate to stay. She thought about how easy it was to defer a decision, to say next spring or next year or when circumstances improve. and how those deferrals could accumulate until they became not a series of choices, but a single unchangeable fact. Had Mr. Fairfax intended to stay forever? Or had he, year after year, convinced himself that his departure was merely postponed, not abandoned? Had he believed, even in his 60th year, that next spring he would finally make the move he had been planning since he was 40? The human capacity for self-deception was remarkable, Miss Marple reflected. People could persuade themselves of almost anything, if the alternative was too uncomfortable to contemplate. But there was another possibility, one that troubled her more deeply. Perhaps Mr. Fairfax had not deceived himself at all. Perhaps he had understood quite clearly that his plans would never come to fruition, that each deferral was final, that he would live and die in Mrs. Lyle's spare room. Perhaps he had known, and simply lacked the strength or the means to do anything about it. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the quiet room. Outside, the January darkness was complete, and the village slept peacefully, secure in its comfortable narratives. But Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that comfort and truth were not always compatible, sat wakeful and thoughtful, contemplating the slow erosion of human possibility and wondering at what point deferral became imprisonment. Chapter 5: The Comfort of a Generous Story. It was inevitable, Miss Marple supposed, that in a village the size of St. Mary Mead, certain questions would begin to surface. Death, even the most natural and expected, had a way of loosening tongues and encouraging speculation. People who would never dream of voicing doubts during a person's lifetime found themselves suddenly willing to wonder aloud once that person was safely buried. The first hint of it came from an unexpected quarter. Young Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, had arrived for a brief visit, and over lunch he made an observation that carried the particular blend of sophistication and naivety characteristic of London intellectuals encountering country life. "This Fairfax business seems rather odd, doesn't it?" he remarked, helping himself to more potatoes. A man living as a permanent guest for 20 years, one can't help wondering about the financial arrangements. "In what sense, dear?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Well, inheritance, for one thing. If this Mrs. Lyle is elderly and wealthy, and Fairfax lived in her house for 2 decades, mightn't he have expected something in her will? People have been murdered for less." Dr. Haydock examined him thoroughly, Miss Marple pointed out. He found nothing suspicious. "Yes, but heart failure can be induced, can't it? There are substances that leave no trace." Miss Marple regarded her nephew with fond exasperation. "You've been reading too many detective novels, Raymond. Not everything is a murder." But after he had departed, his words lingered in her mind, not because she thought them accurate, but because they represented a line of thinking that would almost certainly occur to others, and indeed, by the following week, whispers had begun to circulate. Miss Marple encountered them first in the baker's shop, where 2 women she knew only slightly were discussing the matter in hushed tones that nonetheless carried quite well across the small space. "I'm not saying anything untoward happened," one was insisting, "but you must admit the timing is peculiar. Just after the holidays, when people are expected to leave." "Perhaps his heart simply gave out," her companion suggested. "Or perhaps someone's patience finally gave out. 20 years is a very long time to have a guest." Miss Marple purchased her bread without comment, but she noted the conversation with interest. The village was beginning to question what it had previously accepted without examination. At the post office, she overheard Mrs. Price speaking with Miss Hartnell. "I've always wondered about the financial burden. Mrs. Lyle is comfortable, certainly, but feeding and housing an extra person for 2 decades must have been costly. Perhaps there was resentment." "Mrs. Lyle has never shown the slightest sign of resentment," Miss Hartnell replied firmly. "She's a saint, that woman." "Saints can grow weary too." Even Colonel Melchett, who prided himself on his practical good sense, ventured an opinion when Miss Marple encountered him outside the church. "Fellow was probably in the will," he declared. "These long-term arrangements usually involve some sort of understanding. Wouldn't be surprised if there'd been a quarrel about it. Old lady changes her mind, guest gets upset, things escalate." But Mr. Fairfax died of natural causes, Miss Marple reminded him gently. Yes, of course. Still makes one think, doesn't it? It did make one think, though not, Miss Marple reflected, in the directions the village was pursuing. The speculation swirling through St. Mary Mead was focused on the wrong questions entirely. People were wondering whether Mrs. Lyle might have harmed Mr. Fairfax, whether he might have expected an inheritance, whether there had been quarrels or resentment. But these were the surface explanations, the dramatic possibilities that appealed to minds seeking clear villainy and obvious motives. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, was both simpler and more complex than murder. What interested her was how quickly the village's doubts were suppressed. The speculation never developed into genuine suspicion, never hardened into actual accusation. Instead, it dissipated like morning mist, and always for the same reason. Mrs. Lyle's reputation was unassailable. Miss Marple observed this process most clearly during a gathering at the vicarage, where several ladies had assembled for the quarterly meeting of the Church Improvement Committee. Mrs. Lyle was present, having donated generously to the restoration of the stained glass windows, and the conversation naturally turned to Mr. Fairfax. It must have been such a relief when de Haydock confirmed there was nothing suspicious, Miss Weatherby said, with more candour than tact. One hears such dreadful stories about companions and elderly people. A brief uncomfortable silence followed this remark. Mrs. Lyle, to her credit, showed no sign of offence. Dr. Haydock was very thorough, she said calmly. He assured me that Mr. Fairfax's heart had simply worn out. These things happened at a certain age. Of course they do, the vicar's wife said quickly. And you looked after him so wonderfully all these years. We all know what a kind and patient woman you are, Mrs. Lyle. I simply did what anyone would have done, Mrs. Lyle replied, and her voice carried that particular note of gentle firmness that discouraged further discussion. Mr. Fairfax needed a home, and I was able to provide one. There's nothing mysterious about Christian charity. The matter was settled. The ladies nodded approvingly, and moved on to discussing the stained glass windows. But Miss Marple, pouring tea with careful attention, noticed how perfectly Mrs. Lyle had deployed her defence. Not through protestation or indignation, but through the simple invocation of her established narrative. She had done what anyone would do. It was merely Christian charity. The story was too comfortable to question. It reflected too well on Mrs. Lyle, and by extension on the village, that had admired her for so long. To doubt it would be to doubt their own judgment, their own understanding of human character. And so they chose not to doubt. Walking home that evening, Miss Marple considered how powerfully a well-established story could protect itself. Mrs. Lyle had been cast as the generous benefactor for 20 years. That role had been reinforced through countless retellings, countless moments when her patience had been praised and her kindness admired. To suggest now that there might be something troubling in the arrangement, something exploitative or confining, would require dismantling an entire edifice of comfortable assumptions. It would mean acknowledging that the village had perhaps misunderstood a situation it had observed for 2 decades. People rarely welcome such acknowledgements. The speculation about murder or inheritance or resentment faded quickly because it threatened only individual reputations. But the deeper questions about whether kindness could become a form of control, whether generosity could trap as effectively as cruelty, these threatened something more fundamental. They threatened the stories people told themselves about virtue and goodness and the proper order of things. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking back toward Rosehaven visible in the distance. The house stood peaceful in the gathering dusk, its windows glowing warmly. She thought about how eager people were to accept the obvious explanations, the ones that fit comfortably into familiar patterns. Murder, if there had been one, would have been scandalous but comprehensible. The village knew how to respond to scandal, but what they didn't know how to respond to was the possibility that a good woman had done something harmful, not through malice or greed, but through an excess of virtue that had never been examined or questioned. That generosity itself might require boundaries, that charity might sometimes need to be refused rather than endlessly accepted. These were uncomfortable old truths, the kind that made people shift uneasily in their chairs and change the subject. And so the village settled back into its comfortable story. Mrs. Lyle had been generous, Mr. Fairfax had been fortunate, and his death was simply the natural end to an arrangement that had worked perfectly well for everyone involved. Miss Marple let herself into her house and set about preparing her simple supper. She did not share the villagers' certainty, but she also knew that certainty was often more valued than accuracy. The story of Mrs. Lyle's generosity would continue to be told, admired, and held up as an example of Christian virtue, and the questions that mattered most would remain unasked, because asking them would require courage the village did not possess. Chapter 6. When Gratitude Becomes a Rule. Miss Marple had always found it instructive to pay attention to the small details of daily life, the patterns that people established without conscious thought. It was in these unremarkable routines that character revealed itself most clearly, unguarded by the performance that attended more significant occasions. Since Mr. Fairfax's death, she had been assembling a picture of his life from these small observations, piecing together fragments that had been there all along, visible to anyone who had chosen to look. The question of visitors provided the first significant detail. It came up quite accidentally during a conversation with the postmistress, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Fellows, who missed very little that occurred in St. Mary Mead. Odd, really, Mrs. Fellows remarked as she sorted the morning's letters, how Mr. Fairfax never received any personal mail in all those years. Bills for Mrs. Lyle occasionally when he did her shopping, but nothing addressed to him directly. Not a letter, not a card, not even at Christmas. Miss Marple considered this. Not even from the cousin in Somerset. Not that I recall, and I've been postmistress here for 15 years. She paused in her work. You'd think someone, somewhere would write to him, but it was as though he disappeared from everyone's memory except ours. Perhaps he preferred it that way. Perhaps, Mrs. Fellows sounded doubtful, though it seems a lonely way to live, doesn't it? No letters, no visitors calling at the door, just existing in someone else's house. The observation lodged in Miss Marple's mind and prompted further inquiry, conducted with her characteristic discretion. From the baker's wife she learned that Mr. Fairfax had indeed never received visitors at Rosehaven. Not once in all the years I've been delivering there. Mrs. Lyle has callers regularly, of course, but no one ever came specifically to see Mr. Fairfax. From the woman who cleaned the church, she discovered that Mr. Fairfax had always sat alone during services. Mrs. Lyle would be surrounded by friends after the sermon, everyone wanting a word with her, but Mr. Fairfax would slip out quietly, never stopping to chat. The picture that emerged was of a man who had somehow become severed from all social connections beyond his relationship with Mrs. Lyle. No correspondence, no visitors, no friendships, maintained independently of his hostess. It was as though he had ceased to exist as a separate person and had become merely an extension of Mrs. Lyle's household. But it was another detail mentioned by Dr. Haydock during one of his calls that proved most illuminating. "I was thinking about Fairfax the other day," the doctor said, accepting his customary cup of tea. "Remembering my visits to Rosehaven over the years, he was always excessively grateful for the smallest attention, almost uncomfortably so." "In what way?" "Oh, thanking me profusely for simply doing my job. If I prescribed something for his rheumatism, he'd act as though I'd performed some extraordinary service, and he was the same with Mrs. Lyle. I remember once arriving when she'd just brought him a cup of tea, and the way he thanked her. You'd have thought she'd saved his life rather than simply performed a minor courtesy." "Some people are naturally effusive," Miss Marple suggested. "Yes, but this was different. It wasn't effusiveness exactly, it was more like..." Dr. Haydock paused, searching for the right word. "Like someone perpetually aware they might be turned out at any moment, as though each cup of tea, each small kindness, needed to be acknowledged with excessive gratitude, lest the provider grow tired of giving." Miss Marple's hand stilled in her knitting. "That's a very perceptive observation." "Is it? I'm not sure I thought of it that way at the time, but looking back there was something almost desperate about his gratitude, as though he could never quite believe in the security of his position. After Dr. Haydock had left, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She thought about her own observations of Mr. Fairfax on those occasions when their paths had crossed in the village. The way he had thanked the greengrocer for simply serving him, his voice carrying that particular note of deference that went beyond ordinary politeness. The way he had stepped aside on the pavement when meeting anyone, always making himself smaller, less obtrusive. The way he had seemed to apologize constantly and silently for taking up space in the world. It reminded her of something she had witnessed many years ago during a visit to her cousin in London. There had been a dog in the household, rescued from some unfortunate situation, and despite months of kind treatment, it had never lost its cringing demeanour. It would approach its food bowl with grateful hesitation, would accept affection as though it were an undeserved gift, would flinch at sudden movements even when no harm was intended. The dog had been so thoroughly trained by its previous circumstances that it could not unlearn the lessons of dependence and submission, even when those circumstances had changed. Miss Marple had found it painful to watch, and now she wondered if Mr. Fairfax had been similarly trained, not by cruelty, but by the very structure of his situation. When one's entire existence depended on another person's continued generosity, when one had no independent means or alternative arrangements, gratitude stopped being an emotion freely given and became instead a necessary performance, a kind of rent paid for the space one occupied. She thought about how exhausting that must have been, to wake each morning and remember that one was a guest, that one's presence was an imposition however graciously borne, that every cup of tea and every meal represented someone else's charity rather than one's own right, to never be able to simply exist without owing thanks. The following afternoon brought an unexpected caller. The draper's assistant, the young woman whose grandmother had worked at Rosehaven, appeared at Miss Marple's door with a hesitant expression. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Miss Marple," she said, twisting her gloves nervously. "But I've been thinking about Mr. Fairfax since we spoke, and I remembered something else Gran told me." "Please, do come in," Miss Marple said warmly. Settled with tea, the young woman continued. Gran said that Mr. Fairfax never used the main sitting room when Mrs. Lyle had guests. He'd retreat to his room or go for a walk, even in bad weather. Mrs. Lyle never asked him to leave, you understand. It was his own choice. Did your grandmother know why? She asked him once, apparently, very politely, just wondering if he was feeling unwell. And he said, Gran remembered this exactly. He said, "It's Mrs. Lyle's house and these are her friends. I shouldn't presume." After how many years was this? Gran worked there in the late 30s, so it would have been 5 or 6 years after he'd arrived. Long enough, you'd think, for him to feel he had some claim to the common rooms. After the girl had departed, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window, looking out toward Rosehaven. She thought about a man who, after years of residence, still felt he had no right to sit in the drawing room when visitors called, who thanked excessively for ordinary kindnesses, who had no correspondence, no callers, no life beyond the 4 walls of a house that would never truly be his home. And she thought about gratitude, which should have been a grace note in life, a spontaneous response to genuine kindness, but which could become, under certain circumstances, a leash, a rule one had to follow to maintain one's place, a performance that could never be dropped, because dropping it might mean losing everything, gratitude as the price of shelter, gratitude as the condition of continued welcome, gratitude not as a feeling but as an obligation owed perpetually like interest on a debt that could never be fully repaid. Miss Marple had known people who lived their entire lives in such arrangements. Poor relations, dependent spinsters, impoverished gentlewomen who resided in the homes of more fortunate family members. Some of these arrangements were genuinely kind and equitable, but others became a kind of genteel imprisonment, where the dependent person slowly disappeared beneath the weight of endless mandatory gratitude. She wondered which kind Mr. Fairfax's situation had been, or rather, she thought she already knew. Chapter 7. The Year That No One Counted. It was while sorting through some old parish records at the vicar's request that Miss Marple came across the detail that would prove most revealing. The vicar had asked several of the more reliable parishioners to help organise decades of church correspondence, a task that required patience and attention to detail, both of which Miss Marple possessed in abundance. Among the files was a folder containing records of charitable contributions, and in it she found a letter dated 1938. It was from Mr. Fairfax to the vicar of that time, a Reverend Matthews, whom Miss Marple dimly remembered as a kindly man who had died during the war. The letter was brief and formal, enclosing a small donation to the Church Restoration Fund and expressing Mr. Fairfax's gratitude for the warm welcome he had received in St. Mary Mead. What struck Miss Marple was the return address written in careful copperplate at the top of the page: Mr. J. Fairfax, The Laurels, Weston-super-Mare, not Rosehaven, not St. Mary Mead. She read the letter again, noting the date. 1938 would have been approximately 5 years after Mr. Fairfax's arrival in the village. The letter suggested he had been staying elsewhere, at least temporarily, and had maintained sufficient connection to his own affairs to make charitable donations from his own address. It was a small thing, but it indicated a level of independence that seemed entirely absent from the Mr. Fairfax she had observed in later years. Miss Marple mentioned the discovery to the vicar when she returned the sorted files. "How interesting," he said, examining the letter. "I had no idea Mr. Fairfax had maintained his own establishment at any point. I've only known him as Mrs. Lyle's permanent guest." "Perhaps it was a brief arrangement," Miss Marple suggested. "A temporary lodging that didn't last." "Perhaps, though one wonders what changed." Indeed, one did wonder. The question continued to occupy Miss Marple's thoughts over the following days, and she found herself pursuing it with delicate inquiries among those who might remember the relevant period. Mrs. Bantry, when consulted, recalled that there had been some years when Mr. Fairfax had been less frequently seen in St. Mary Mead. "This would have been in the late 30s, she said, frowning in concentration. "He'd come for visits, you understand, but he wasn't permanently in residence. I remember remarking to Arthur that it seemed a more sensible arrangement, allowing both parties some independence." "When did he return permanently?" "Now that's harder to say. It was gradual, I think. He'd stay for longer periods, and then at some point one realised he was simply always there. It must have been just before the war, or perhaps during the early part of it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The war years, with their disruptions and uncertainties, would have been an ideal time for temporary arrangements to become permanent, for lodgings to be given up as unnecessary expenses, for independence to be quietly abandoned in favour of security. But it was Mrs. Simmons, the librarian with her precise memory for dates and details, who provided the most illuminating information. "I remember 1946 quite clearly," she said, when Miss Marple mentioned the subject during a quiet afternoon at the library. "That was the year Mr. Fairfax stopped receiving the Western Gazette." "He subscribed to the newspaper?" "For years. From 1933, when he first arrived, all through the war. It was delivered weekly, forwarded from Somerset, but in 1946 the delivery stopped. I noticed because I helped sort the post in those days, and one becomes accustomed to regular items." "Did you ask him about it?" "Not directly, but I mentioned in passing that I hadn't seen the Gazette in a while, and he said—" Mrs. Simmons paused, clearly recalling the conversation with care. "He said there was no point keeping up with Western news anymore, as he had no connections there now. His family had been from that area, his mother's people, I believe, but by 1946 they would have been gone. The war took many, and others simply moved away or passed on from age." After leaving the library, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, turning over this new information. She was beginning to perceive a pattern, a gradual narrowing of Mr. Fairfax's world that had occurred in stages, almost imperceptibly. In 1933, he had arrived as a temporary guest, intending to stay only weeks. But he had maintained his own address in Weston-super-Mare, had subscribed to the local newspaper, had made charitable donations from his own funds. He had possessed, in other words, an identity separate from his role as Mrs. Lyle's guest. By the late 1930s, that independence had begun to erode. The Western address had been given up, though he still maintained enough connection to the area to receive the weekly newspaper. And then in 1946, even that tenuous, link had been severed, no more newspaper, no more connections to anywhere beyond St Mary Mead, no more evidence of a life that existed independently of Rosehaven. The question was whether this narrowing had been a choice or something else entirely. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visit from Miss Weatherby, who arrived with a preoccupied expression and a matter she clearly wished to discuss. "I've been thinking about our conversations regarding Mr. Fairfax," she began, once settled with tea, "and I remembered something that has been troubling me. About 10 years ago, perhaps a bit more, I mentioned to Mr. Fairfax that I was planning a visit to Bath and asked if he had any recommendations for hotels or restaurants, as I thought he might have local knowledge of the area. And did he? That's just it. He looked quite startled and said he hadn't been to Bath in over a decade. When I asked if he wouldn't like to visit again sometime, perhaps join a coach tour or take the train, he said." Miss Weatherby paused, her brow furrowed. "He said he didn't like to be away from Rosehaven for too long, that Mrs. Lyle might need him." "Did Mrs. Lyle require constant attendance?" "Not at all. She was perfectly healthy and capable, and she had a daily woman who came in to help with household tasks. But Mr. Fairfax seemed genuinely anxious about the idea of being absent, even for a day or two." After Miss Weatherby had departed, Miss Marple sat by her fire, watching the flames dance and thinking about the invisible walls that could confine a person as effectively as any physical barrier. Mr. Fairfax had not been locked in his room. He had been free to walk about the village, to attend church, to run errands. But at some point, his world had contracted to such a degree that even a brief trip to Bath seemed impossible. Not because of any external prohibition, but because he had internalized the belief that he could not leave, that he was needed, that his place was at Rosehaven and nowhere else. She thought about the stop newspaper subscription in 1946, that final severing of connection to anywhere beyond the village. What had happened that year to make Mr. Fairfax decide, or accept, that there was no point maintaining even the most tenuous link to his past? Had he made a conscious decision that his life would henceforth be contained entirely within the boundaries of Mrs. Lyle's household? Or had he simply acknowledged what had already become true, that he had nowhere else to go, no one else who remembered him, no place in the world beyond the spare room he occupied? The mathematics of such a realization were cruel. At some point, probably after the war, when so many connections had been permanently severed, Mr. Fairfax had looked at his life and understood that he had become completely dependent on Mrs. Lyle's hospitality, that without it, he would have nothing and no one, and with that understanding, Miss Marple suspected, had come a terrible certainty that he could not afford to do anything that might jeopardize that hospitality, could not be too demanding, too present, too anything except grateful and unobtrusive, could not in fact ever leave, because leaving would require having somewhere to go and something to go to. The year in 46, when the newspaper stopped coming, had probably been the year when Mr. Fairfax had finally counted up his remaining connections and found the sum to be 0. After that, there had been nothing to do but stay and be grateful for the staying, and hope that Mrs. Lyle's patience would outlast his remaining years. It had, but only just. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, looking out at the darkened village. Somewhere out there, Rosehaven stood quiet and still, its spare room finally empty. She wondered if anyone else understood that Mr. Fairfax had not stayed, because he was welcomed, but because he had felt he had no right to go. Chapter 8. A kindness that could not be withdrawn. Understanding came to Miss Marple not in a sudden flash of insight, but gradually the way dawn comes in winter, so slowly that one cannot point to the exact moment when darkness becomes light. She was sitting in her garden on a mild February afternoon, enjoying the early snowdrops that had emerged near the south wall, when the final piece of the puzzle settled into place. It came from thinking not about Mr. Fairfax, but about Mrs. Lyle. What did it mean to be known throughout a village as exceptionally generous? What did it cost to maintain such a reputation? And more importantly, what would it cost to relinquish it? Miss Marple had known women like Mrs. Lyle before. Good women, genuinely kind, who had organised their entire sense of self around their role as benefactors. They served on committees, donated to causes, opened their homes to those in need, and in doing so they became indispensable to their communities and perhaps, more significantly, to their own understanding of who they were. But what happened when the recipients of their charity no longer needed them? The question had been forming in Miss Marple's mind for days, and now it crystallised into something close to certainty. She thought about the various accounts she had gathered of Mrs. Lyle's relationship with Mr. Fairfax, and she realised that in every story, every anecdote, Mrs. Lyle had been the active party and Mr. Fairfax the passive recipient. Mrs. Lyle had taken him in. Mrs. Lyle had insisted he stay. Mrs. Lyle had discouraged him from seeking lodgings in Much Benham. Mrs. Lyle had needed his help with her house party. Mrs. Lyle had required his presence when she was unwell. Always Mrs. Lyle's needs, Mrs. Lyle's decisions, Mrs. Lyle's household. And Mr. Fairfax had remained, grateful and obliging, the permanent evidence of her exceptional virtue. Miss Marple rose and walked slowly back into her house, this new understanding settling over her like a weight. She had not wanted to see it quite so clearly, had hoped perhaps that she was wrong, but the more she considered it, the more inevitable it seemed. Mrs. Lyle had not imprisoned Mr. Fairfax through cruelty. She had done so through an excess of kindness that could not be questioned, because it was, in fact, genuine kindness. She had truly wished to help him after his misfortunes. She had truly opened her home and provided him shelter. But somewhere along the way, his presence had become necessary to her, in ways that had nothing to do with his welfare, and everything to do with her own identity. The validation that came from being known as the woman who had looked after poor Mr. Fairfax for 20 years. The sense of purpose derived from having someone dependent on her charity. The moral authority that came from such visible and sustained generosity. To let him go would have required admitting that her kindness had limits, that charity need not be eternal, that helping someone sometimes meant enabling them to leave rather than encouraging them to stay. And that admission would have threatened something fundamental in how Mrs. Lyle understood herself. Miss Marple thought about the lodgings in Much Benham, discouraged as wasteful, the visit to Somerset forestalled by the house party, the walking tour cancelled for Mrs. Lyle's illness. Each time there had been a reason, perfectly valid, why Mr. Fairfax should remain at Rosehaven. Each time Mrs. Lyle had needed him to stay. Not because she could not manage without him, but because his departure would have represented a kind of failure, would have suggested that her generosity had been insufficient, that he had preferred independence to her hospitality, that the arrangement she had maintained so proudly for so long was something to be escaped from rather than appreciated. The next morning brought Dr. Haydock, ostensibly on his rounds, but really Miss Marple suspected because he wished to think aloud about Mr. Fairfax in the presence of someone who would listen carefully. "I've been wondering," he said, accepting tea with the ease of long familiarity, "whether I should have said something years ago about the arrangement at Rosehaven." "What would you have said?" "That's just it, I'm not sure. Nothing was wrong exactly. Fairfax was housed and fed and looked after. Mrs. Lyle was unfailingly kind. But there was something unhealthy about it, I think. The way he seemed to shrink over the years, becoming smaller and more apologetic, the way he could never quite believe in his right to be there, even after a decade. Did you ever suggest he might benefit from more independence?" "Once, very delicately. I mentioned to Mrs. Lyle that a change of scene might do Mr. Fairfax good, perhaps a holiday or a visit to relatives. She became quite distressed, said he had no relatives, nowhere else to go, that she couldn't possibly turn him out when he had no one else to care for him." Dr. Haydock stirred his tea thoughtfully. The thing was, she was quite sincere. She genuinely believed she was protecting him. From what? From the world, I suppose, from having to fend for himself again after his failure, from the risk of further disappointment. He paused. It never seemed to occur to her that she might also be protecting herself. From what? Miss Marple asked again, though she suspected she knew the answer. From having to question whether her generosity was truly selfless, from having to acknowledge that keeping someone dependent might serve her needs as much as theirs. After Dr. Haydock had departed, Miss Marple sat quietly, thinking about the peculiar cruelty of kindness that could not bear to be refused or outgrown. She understood now why Mr. Fairfax had stayed. Not because Mrs. Lisle had prevented him from leaving through any overt means, but because the entire structure of their relationship had been built on the premise of his need and her generosity. To leave would have been to reject that generosity, to suggest it was insufficient or unwelcome. And Mr. Fairfax, broken by failure and loss, grateful for any shelter in the storm, had not possessed the strength to commit such an apparent ingratitude. So he had stayed year after year, his world narrowing, his connection severing, his sense of self eroding, until he was nothing more than the grateful recipient of Mrs. Lisle's Christian charity. And Mrs. Lisle had maintained her role as benefactor, her identity secure, her reputation for generosity enhanced with each passing year, never quite acknowledging that she was keeping someone in a position of permanent dependence because releasing him would have required her to be something other than the endlessly generous woman she believed herself to be. Neither of them had meant for it to become what it became, but intention, Miss Marple reflected, was not the same as outcome. Mrs. Lisle had offered shelter to someone in need, which was good, but she had needed that person to remain in need, which was not. And Mr. Fairfax had accepted charity when he required it, which was reasonable, but he had remained in a position of charity long after it had ceased to serve his true welfare, which was tragic. The arrangement had suited them both in some ways, even as it slowly diminished them both. And now it was over, ended not by choice or courage, but by the simple fact of Mr. Fairfax's heart giving out on a January night. Miss Marple looked out her window toward Rosehaven, peaceful in the winter sunlight. She wondered if Mrs. Lisle understood yet what she had done, or if she would continue to see herself, as she always had, as the generous woman who had given Mr. Fairfax a home. The truth was more complicated than that and far more sad. Chapter 9. Miss Marple names the mistake. The opportunity to speak with Mrs. Lisle came unexpectedly, though Miss Marple had been considering for some days whether such a conversation was necessary or wise. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Miss Marple had been passing Rosehaven on her way back from the lending library, when she noticed Mrs. Lisle in the front garden, standing quite still before a rose bush had been pruned back for winter. There was something in her posture, a quality of stillness that went beyond simple contemplation, that made Miss Marple pause at the gate. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Lisle," she called gently. "Those roses will be magnificent come summer." Mrs. Lisle turned, and Miss Marple saw that her face carried an expression of profound weariness. Not the simple fatigue of physical exertion, but something deeper, the exhaustion that comes from carrying uncomfortable truths one has not yet learned how to acknowledge. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to stop, Mrs." Lisle's voice maintained its customary composure, but there was a fragility beneath it. "Would you care to come in for tea? I find the house rather quiet these days." It was not quite an admission, but it was close enough. The drawing-room at Rosehaven was exactly as Miss Marple had imagined it would be, comfortable without being ostentatious, arranged with care, reflecting its owner's taste for order and propriety. Mrs. Lisle moved through the familiar ritual of preparing tea with the precision of long habit, and Miss Marple waited patiently, knowing that the important things would emerge in their own time. "I've been meaning to thank you for attending the funeral," Mrs. Lisle said, settling into her chair. "It was well attended, which surprised me somewhat. Mr. Fairfax was such a quiet presence in the village. People wished to pay their respects." "Yes, I suppose so." Mrs. Lisle gazed into her teacup. "Though I wonder how many of them truly knew him, how many had spoken with him, beyond a simple greeting in the street." "Not many, I suspect." "No, not many." She set down her cup with careful precision. I find myself thinking about that rather often now, about how little anyone really knew him, how he lived here for 20 years and yet remained, in many ways, invisible. Miss Marple said nothing, sensing that Mrs. Lyle was approaching something she needed to say without assistance. Dr. Haydock came to call yesterday, Mrs. Lyle continued. Very kind of him, checking on my welfare. We spoke about Mr. Fairfax, about his years here, and the doctor said something that has stayed with me. He said that Mr. Fairfax had seemed to grow smaller over time, more apologetic, as though he was perpetually uncertain of his welcome. Did that surprise you? It did, rather. I had always tried to make him feel at home, you see, to let him know that his presence was valued. Mrs. Lyle's hands twisted together in her lap, but Dr. Haydock suggested that perhaps Mr. Fairfax had never quite felt he had a right to be here, that he remained always a guest, never quite certain of his position. Miss Marple chose her words with care. It can be difficult, I think, to feel at home in someone else's house, no matter how welcoming they may be. Yes, I'm beginning to understand that. Mrs. Lyle rose and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where she had been standing when Miss Marple arrived. I've been going through Mr. Fairfax's things, you see, making arrangements for what little he left, and I found a box in his wardrobe tucked away at the back. She turned to face Miss Marple, and there was something haunted in her expression. It contained letters, not many, perhaps a dozen over the years, from the cousin in Somerset I mentioned, inviting him to visit, from an old school friend suggesting they meet in London, from an employment agency offering to help him find a suitable position. Mrs. Lyle's voice grew quieter. He never showed me these letters, never mentioned them, and I found myself wondering why. Miss Marple waited. I think, Mrs. Lyle said slowly, he was afraid I would be hurt, or perhaps disappointed, as though expressing any desire to leave, even temporarily, would have been a betrayal of my hospitality. And would it have been? The question hung in the air between them. Mrs. Lyle returned to her chair, moving like someone who has aged considerably in a short time. I would have said no. I would have insisted that he was perfectly free to come and go as he pleased, that I wished only for his happiness. She paused. But I'm no longer certain that would have been entirely true. It was an extraordinary admission, and Miss Marple recognised the courage it required. When Mr. Fairfax first came to Rosehaven, Mrs. Lyle continued, I was pleased to help him, genuinely pleased. He had suffered such misfortunes, and I had the means to offer him shelter. It felt right, you understand, Christian charity in its truest form. I'm sure it was. But somewhere along the way, Mrs. Lyle faltered, then pressed on. Somewhere along the way, I began to need it. Need him to be here, need him to need me. It became part of who I was. The woman who had taken in poor Mr. Fairfax. The woman whose charity had no limits. Her voice carried a note of self-recognition that was almost painful to hear. People admired me for it, she said. I won't pretend that didn't matter. And Mr. Fairfax was so grateful, always so grateful. It was reassuring in a way, to know that one was doing good, that one was needed. That's a very human response, Miss Marple said gently. Perhaps. But I wonder now if I discouraged him from leaving because I feared what it would mean if he did. Not for him, but for me. Mrs. Lyle looked directly at Miss Marple. If he had found lodgings in Much Benham, if he had visited his cousin, if he had taken that position the employment agency offered, it would have suggested that my home was not enough, that my generosity was insufficient, that he preferred independence to my hospitality, and that would have been difficult to accept. More than difficult, it would have required me to acknowledge that my charity had limits, that there might come a point when the kindest thing would be to encourage him to leave rather than to keep him here. Mrs. Lyle's voice grew steadier, as though naming the truth had given her strength. I told myself I was protecting him from disappointment, from the harshness of the world, but I was also protecting myself from having to be anything other than the generous benefactor I had become. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Lyle, may I speak plainly?" "Please do. I find I've had quite enough of comfortable fictions." "I think you offered Mr. Fairfax shelter when he desperately needed it, and that was genuinely kind. But I also think the arrangement continued long past the point where it served his welfare and neither of you knew how to change it. He could not leave without appearing ungrateful, and you could not encourage him to leave without appearing less charitable than your reputation suggested." "So we both remained trapped," Mrs. Lyle said quietly, "by kindness that had outlived its purpose." "In a sense, yes." Mrs. Lyle sat in silence for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think he was unhappy here?" It was the question she'd been avoiding, and Miss Marple knew that her answer mattered deeply. "I think," she said carefully, "that Mr. Fairfax was grateful for your kindness, and that gratitude is real and should be honoured. But I also think that gratitude and happiness are not the same thing, and that it is possible to be grateful for shelter while still longing for a life of one's own. A life he never had. No, but that was not entirely your fault, Mrs. Lyle. These situations are rarely simple. Mr. Fairfax made his own choices, or failed to make them. The world offered him few alternatives after his misfortunes, and you acted from genuine kindness, even if that kindness became complicated over time." "Complicated," Mrs. Lyle repeated. "What a gentle word for what I've done." "What you must be careful of now," Miss Marple said, her voice taking on a firmer note, "is not to transform this understanding into an excuse for excessive guilt. You did not imprison Mr. Fairfax maliciously. You made mistakes, as all of us do when our needs become entangled with our virtues. The important thing is that you can see it now." Mrs. Lyle looked up, and there were tears in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. "What should I have done differently?" "You should have asked him what he wanted," Miss Marple said simply. "Not once, but repeatedly. Not what he was grateful for, but what he wished for his life. And when he expressed any desire for independence, you should have helped him achieve it rather than finding reasons why he should stay. One must be careful, you see, not to make generosity a condition someone cannot escape." The words settled between them like a verdict, gentle but unsparing. "I understand," Mrs. Lyle said finally. "I understand now what I could not see while he was alive, that true charity sometimes means letting people go, that keeping someone safe can also mean keeping them small, that the kindest thing is not always the thing that makes us feel most generous." She rose and walked to the window again, her back to Miss Marple. "Thank you for your honesty. It could not have been easy to speak so plainly to someone you barely know." "I think you needed to hear it," Miss Marple said, "and I think perhaps you already knew it, but required someone else to say it aloud." Mrs. Lyle nodded without turning around, and Miss Marple understood that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. She rose quietly and let herself out, leaving Mrs. Lyle to her thoughts and her grief. Walking home through the February afternoon, Miss Marple felt the weight of what had passed between them. It had been necessary, but it had not been easy. Some truths were like that, necessary and difficult in equal measure, but at least they were now spoken. Chapter 10, When the House Fell Quiet Again. Spring came early that year, arriving in tentative stages through late February and into March. The snowdrops gave way to crocuses, and the bare branches of the village trees began to show the first hints of green. Life continued its steady progress, as it always did, indifferent to human complications. Mr. Fairfax's burial had been a properly solemn affair, attended by more people than had ever spoken to him during his life. Miss Marple had observed this phenomenon before, the way death granted a person significance they had been denied while living. The headstone, when it was erected in the churchyard, bore a simple inscription, Julian Fairfax, 1889 to 1953, and below it, in smaller letters, In God's Keeping. Mrs. Lyle had chosen the words, and Miss Marple thought them appropriate in their restraint. They suggested release rather than loss, which seemed fitting. In the weeks following their conversation, Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Lyle from a careful distance, not wishing to intrude but mindful of the burden she now carried. The awareness of what one has done, even unknowingly, was a heavy thing to bear, and Miss Marple knew that such awareness could not be hurried through or avoided. It had to be lived with until one learned how to carry it. Mrs. Lyle appeared to be doing precisely that. She continued her usual activities, attended church, served on her committees, but there was a quietness to her now, a quality of reflection that had not been present before. She spoke less and listened more, and when she did speak of charitable matters, her words carried a new caution, as though she were measuring them against some internal standard she had only recently discovered. Miss Marple encountered her one afternoon in early March, both of them attending a meeting of the Church Restoration Committee. Afterward, as they walked together toward the High Street, Mrs. Lyle mentioned something that Miss Marple found significant. "I've closed the spare room," she said without preamble. "Properly closed it, I mean. Not just shut the door, but removed the guest furnishings. It's going to be a morning room instead, I think. Somewhere to sit and read when the light is good." "That sounds very pleasant," Miss Marple said. "Yes, it does, doesn't it?" Mrs. Lyle paused at the corner. "For years I kept that room ready, as though another guest might arrive at any moment, as though maintaining a spare room was somehow evidence of my willingness to help. But I've come to think that perhaps the most honest thing is to acknowledge that I have no particular calling to long-term hospitality. Better to be truthful about one's limitations than to exceed them and cause harm." It was a small statement, but it represented a considerable shift in understanding, and Miss Marple was pleased to hear it. "That seems very wise," she said gently. They parted at the corner, and Miss Marple continued home, thinking about rooms that were closed and rooms that were opened, and how sometimes the kindest thing one could do was to be honest about what one could and could not offer. That evening, Mrs. Bantry called round for tea, full of news about the village's upcoming Easter preparations. "Mrs. Lyle has offered to arrange the flowers for the church," she reported, settling into her customary chair. "She's always been so good at that sort of thing, though I must say she seems rather different lately. More reserved somehow. Not unfriendly, just more thoughtful." "Perhaps she's finding her way through grief," Miss Marple suggested. "Perhaps, though I wonder if it's something more than that, as though losing Mr. Fairfax has made her question things she'd always taken for granted." Mrs. Bantry paused. "I mentioned to her that my niece might be looking for lodgings while attending a secretarial course in Much Benham, and I thought perhaps she might consider taking in a temporary boarder. But she declined quite firmly, said she'd discovered she valued her privacy more than she'd realized." "That sounds perfectly reasonable." "Oh, it is. It's just, well, it's not what one would have expected from Mrs. Lyle. She's always been so willing to help, so generous with her home." Miss Marple said nothing, but she understood what Mrs. Bantry could not quite articulate. The village had grown accustomed to a particular version of Mrs. Lyle, and any deviation from that version was unsettling, even when the deviation represented greater self-awareness and honesty. But the village would adjust, as it always did. People would learn to see Mrs. Lyle as she was now rather than as she had been, and in time this new version would become as familiar as the old. The following Sunday, Miss Marple attended morning service and noticed that Mrs. Lyle sat in her usual pew, but that the space beside her, the space Mr. Fairfax had occupied for 20 years, remained empty. No one had claimed it, and Mrs. Lyle had not invited anyone to fill it. It remained a visible absence, acknowledged rather than disguised. After the service, as people gathered in small groups outside the church, Miss Marple overheard a conversation that suggested the village was beginning to form a new understanding of what had occurred at Rosehaven. "Poor Mr. Fairfax," Miss Weatherby was saying. "Such a quiet life he had. One wonders if he was truly happy." "I suppose he was grateful for our home," someone replied. "Gratitude and happiness aren't quite the same thing, though, are they?" Miss Weatherby observed. "I've been thinking about that lately, about how one can be grateful for kindness while still longing for something more." It was a subtle shift, but Miss Marple recognized its significance. The village was beginning to see Mr. Fairfax not merely as the fortunate recipient of charity, but as a person who might have had unfulfilled desires, unexplored possibilities, a life that might have taken different forms under different circumstances. It was a more complicated narrative than the comfortable story they had told before, but it was also more truthful. As March progressed and the village prepared for Easter, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on what she had learned through this quiet tragedy. There had been no murder, no dramatic revelation, no villains to be exposed, only two people who had become trapped in an arrangement that had outlived its usefulness, held in place by gratitude and reputation, and the difficulty of acknowledging when something meant kindly has gone wrong. One afternoon, declining Mrs. Lyle's invitation to tea, for there were some invitations that should be gently refused, Miss Marple spoke with her briefly at the garden gate. "The roses are coming along beautifully," she observed. "Yes, they are," Mrs. Lyle agreed. "I've been tending them myself this year, finding it quite satisfying, actually. There's something to be said for working with one's own hands rather than directing others to do it." "Indeed there is." Mrs. Lyle hesitated, then said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Marple, for your honesty that afternoon. It was difficult to hear, but it needed to be said." "I'm glad it was helpful." "It was. I think perhaps I shall spend some time learning to be sufficient to myself, rather than seeking sufficiency through helping others. Not withdrawing from the world, you understand, but finding a better balance." "That sounds very wise indeed." Later, sitting by her fire as the spring evening drew in, Miss Marple reflected on the lesson contained in Mr. Fairfax's sad story. It was a subtle lesson, the kind that could not be reduced to simple maxims or moral pronouncements. It was about the ways that virtue could become vice when pushed too far, about how generosity needed boundaries to remain truly generous, about how receiving required dignity as much as giving did, about the responsibility that